Siddle, and I'm going to help facilitate the discussion today. We've invited Dr. Sarah Negro and Dr. Christian Kugel to facilitate a discussion about promoting practice-based learning opportunities to support teacher performance. Dr. Sarah Negro is an associate professor at George Mason University in the School of Education Division of Special Education and Disability Research. Her research, which has been supported by over $10 million in grant funding, focuses on determining the best practices for teachers in special education. In particular, she examines effective practices to prepare profession-ready teachers to work in inclusive classrooms through the use of experiential learning with an emphasis on reflective practices using technology-enhanced and video-based activities. Dr. Christian Kugel, who's also at George Mason University, is an associate professor of early childhood special education in the Early Childhood Education Program. She is also a board-certified behavior analyst and a licensed behavior analyst in the Commonwealth of Virginia. She specializes in early childhood special education, early intervention, applied behavior analysis, autism spectrum disorders, embedded instruction, multi-tiered systems of supports, universal design for learning, assessment, and program planning. I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Negro and Dr. Kugel to share their slides and then to work with us to facilitate a discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity and thank you for the introduction. We're excited to be here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just to sort of set the context for our discussion today and to give you a bit of an overview of areas that we would like to focus on throughout the hour. Okay, are you able to see everything okay? Wonderful. Thank you. All right, so the first thing that I think is important to set the stage is the goal of what we do and why we do it in teacher education. The goal is to prepare profession-ready teachers. I think that can mean many things, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. So I would just start by saying it's really complicated. If you look at how CEC and even the National Education Association describe profession-ready teachers, it sounds sort of simplistic, right? Like, okay, subject matter and pedagogical content knowledge experts. Well, that's simple, right? Well, actually, it's really complicated. The ability to be able to implement best practices in dynamic settings takes a great deal of expertise and things that go well beyond those two buckets of pedagogy and content or professional knowledge. And I think much of what we do in our work is to think about these more soft skills that apply or generalize across areas of expertise or content knowledge. Things like understanding how to seek and then implement feedback from others, whether it's peers or a coach or a mentor, how to reflect on your practice with the purpose of trying to improve practice and make changes so that you're better meeting the needs of your students. How do you set goals for yourself as a professional? And then how do you monitor your progress in those goals? How do you adjust those goals? So there is a lot that goes into being profession ready. So sometimes we think as teacher educators, well, where do we begin with all of this? How do we target these skills? How do we help teacher candidates feel profession ready upon graduation? And so what I would suggest is that we don't start at the end, meaning we don't start working on these skills in their culminating student teaching field experiences, and rather that we begin a lot earlier in their preparation to help them realize that there are these set of professional skills that are going to be required and are going to support them across implementing all of those different content areas, evidence-based practices, using high leverage practices. So the way I think of it is to try to shift our teacher candidates' mindset. So they go through their K-12 and then even college experience as a student mindset where everything is about compliance. How many do I have to get done? What is the checklist I have to complete? That mindset is one of check it off the list and move on. And what happens is when we have teachers who have that mindset shift into the classroom, they're not embracing this idea of lifelong learning, continually seeking professional improvement. And so rather, what I would suggest is that we try to encourage our teacher candidates to shift towards a learner mindset, where they're engaging in their learning activities, not because it's part of a checklist of things they have to complete, but rather they see these activities that we've structured for them within their preparation as meaningful and helpful and things that they will then use to improve their practice. So the ideal would be that then they take these new skills that they've gained, learning how to seek and implement feedback, learning how to reflect on their practice, learning how to set goals for themselves. They take those skills into the profession with them, and they're empowered to improve their own practice as a retention strategy. So this preparation approach then becomes a retention approach. And this is a shift in the way we think and talk about teacher education, but I think it's an important piece and something that you'll see throughout our discussions in today's webinar. So we'll focus a lot of what we talk about around experiences, because experience is a great teacher. And in particular, we want to talk about practice-based learning opportunities. So growth in the profession is absolutely achievable, but it doesn't just happen on its own. It actually takes work. And on the teacher educators' parts, it takes structure and support and guidance of our teacher candidates in order to get them to see that growth and to know how to recognize that growth. So practice-based learning opportunities, I included a link here, and I can actually copy it into the chat, probably would be the best thing to do. Oops, I'll work on that. To be able to go to the Cedar Center if you want to learn more about how they define practice-based learning opportunities. They give a whole different list of examples. And the idea being, this is where you're practicing your skills as a teacher. And this can take place and should take place, I would argue, well before your formal, final, culminating student teaching experience. And that we should be doing these practice-based learning opportunities early in the teacher education preparation programs and often. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kugel, who's going to talk about one of these opportunities.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Negro. So when we think about those practice-based learning opportunities, there's some key elements that are included. One is that we want to be really intentional in thinking about what is the target skill or practice that we're wanting to develop. And then once we've identified that, we can provide really intentional opportunities to practice that target skill. And so we give an opportunity, the skill is then practiced, and then some type of feedback is delivered. And so sometimes that's going to be affirmative feedback, and sometimes it's going to be suggestive feedback, depending upon how a learner, in this case, a teacher candidate, responds to the opportunity that they were given to practice. So if we think about any new hobby or skill that we've developed across our lifetime, we know that we didn't just automatically learn how to do it and master it. We had to have opportunities to practice to get to mastery. And so that gets back to what Dr. Negro was saying about thinking about the process of providing opportunities throughout a time in which a teacher candidate is being developed. So something we're doing a lot in my house right now is baseball, because we are transitioning into spring Little League baseball. So I'm going to use this as an example to illustrate what I often see when learning opportunities are being provided on the baseball field. And so I get really excited when my son is given these opportunities, and we call them different things in education. Sometimes they're called embedded instruction opportunities. Sometimes they're called learning units. We use different terms to describe these, but I have an example of what happens when the target skill is performed correctly and when the target skill has room for improvement. So for example, the target skill here is fielding a ball or keeping the ball from going past a player, for those who maybe aren't as fortunate to spend hours on a baseball field. But so what happens is the coach hits a ball, the player then stops the ball or fields the ball, and then the coach would provide praise. So you can see how the opportunity was provided, the ball was hit. The learner responded by fielding the ball. That was the correct response or the desired response, and then praise is delivered. Where an opportunity is provided where there might be room for improvement on the other side, this might look like the coach hitting a ball, the ball is not fielded, rolls out into the outfield, for example. And then in this case, the coach would suggest getting the glove lower, perhaps, or whatever kind of specific feedback is needed to get to that desired target skill. And then there's an opportunity to repeat. So as teacher educators, something we really want to focus on is the fidelity of target skills or practices. So fidelity is when a target practice is used the way it was intended to be used. And we have opportunities as teacher educators to promote the fidelity of practice by differentiating the practice opportunities that we provide. So oftentimes, when we're working with adult learners, we might talk about how the adult learner is responding to a practice opportunity. But what we really want to focus on our attention on is, yes, how are they responding to the practice opportunities they're getting, but also then what are we doing in our responsivities? So do we need to intensify the practice opportunities that we're providing, or have they mastered the skill? Are they ready to move on to a new skill? So the focus shifts from the adult learner, or that's still embedded, but the focus also embeds how we are responding to them and the supports that they might need. So as teacher educators, we know that we have a plethora of evidence-based practices. So we know that we can identify practices that we have data to indicate that they result in enhanced outcomes for students and families. Although we know these evidence-based practices exist, although we know where to access them, we also know that there's a gap between what we know works and what is taking place in classrooms and other education settings for children, particularly children with disabilities. So what this means for us is that there's a need for us to really think about those practice opportunities and differentiate the supports that we're providing to ensure that as we are developing teacher candidates, that we're providing those practice opportunities and differentiating the support that we're providing them to ensure that when they leave their teacher education experience, that they are prepared to use evidence-based practices with fidelity. So this can be a challenge, like Dr. Negro started off by saying, it's complicated, right? So again, if we're thinking about how we have to differentiate the practice opportunities that we're providing, because we know all adult learners are different and they're going to need different types of supports to use practices with fidelity, this means that we are going to have to differentiate our approach. And so this might mean that we might intensify the type of feedback that we're providing. So if we think back to the baseball example, some players might need additional practice and additional feedback, which can be a challenge, right? Because when we're thinking about how we typically provide experiential types of learning opportunities in classrooms and other education settings, we're probably envisioning that we're providing feedback face-to-face. So if we then have to intensify that, that becomes a challenge due to logistics such as things like scheduling or getting from point A to point B. So one solution to overcome this challenge is technology. So we have data that indicates the majority of individuals have access to and are using technology. And technology provides us one solution to overcoming this challenge associated with differentiating the supports that we're providing educators to use practices with fidelity. And so the way that we can use technology to differentiate, or one way we can use technology to differentiate the ways in which we're supporting teacher candidates is through ECoaching. So e-coaching is a term that means we're providing feedback through the use of technology. And so we have data that suggests this is one effective approach to supporting the fidelity of practice. We know that feedback that is specific to a target practice, that's affirmative, so it's praising the use of a target practice, that's suggestive, again, suggesting ways that we might improve a practice, and that feedback that is immediate. All of these aspects of feedback are components of the most effective types of feedback. So when we think about using technology to provide feedback, we have a lot of different technology choices. So some of the technologies that we use are real time to provide feedback, and others are more delayed. And we have data that suggests both work. So immediate examples would be things like what you see in this bigger circle here in that picture. So using a bug in ear or Bluetooth device paired with video conferencing like Zoom or Google Meets, so that when a teacher candidate is practicing a target skill, they're getting real-time in the moment feedback that is specific, affirmative, suggestive, and the most immediate. There are other types of technologies that can be used, which would still be considered more immediate forms of feedback, but are more delayed in nature. So this would be things like doing a video conferencing observation, or maybe a teacher candidate submitting a video and then using email to provide feedback. So they're not getting that feedback in the moment in real time, but they're still getting it fairly quickly to when the observation occurred. There's also, we also have data that suggests things like delayed video conferencing. So after conducting an observation, whether that's through video conferencing system or a video, but a teacher candidate and teacher educator might meet using Zoom or Google Meets or some other type of video conferencing system to provide feedback face-to-face in that way as well. So we have a lot of options when it comes to using technology to provide feedback, which allows us to, one, differentiate the support that a teacher candidate needs to use a practice with fidelity, and then also facilitates the opportunity to do so because it allows us to overcome those challenges associated with face-to-face observations. And we know that technology is something that a large majority of people are using.
Thank you, Dr. Kugel. So I'm going to continue on and talk about another example of how we can use technology to target some of these profession-ready skills, and that's through the use of the engagement in video analysis. And actually, these e-coaching that Dr. Kugel was talking about in the video analysis components that I'm going to talk about really do pair very well together. We've actually been fortunate enough to run some studies together on these topics and looking at how they can be brought together to make a cohesive experience that really emphasizes that learner mindset of how do you authentically engage in your learning and your professional development rather than a compliance mindset. So just a plug for some of the work that we've been doing together. So video analysis is the process by which teacher candidates or even in-service teachers record their teaching, review their video evidence, reflect on what they see, and then revise their practice in the most simplistic form to then try to improve practice. So this 4 R's: record, review, reflect, revise. And the term video analysis suggests that it's happening in authentic classroom settings. So there are many different types of practice-based learning opportunities that are similar to video analysis, like micro teaching or simulated teaching, where you're doing role play with your colleagues. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But I want to just point out that they're different because the thing that's unique about video analysis is that it's occurring in authentic classroom settings. And those settings are very dynamic. You cannot control for, every aspect of classroom management and student engagement and just typical things that happen in the days, in the schedule, fire drill, whatever it may be. those things that sort of make you have to reflect in practice as a teacher and be responsive and flexible in practice as a teacher, those are the things that are different and unique to video analysis as compared to some of those more controlled micro teaching where you maybe have a small group of students, you're pulled away from the classroom, you're targeting one little specific skill as the teacher candidate that you really want to practice or refine, and you're taping for a very short segment of time. That's not the same thing as saying you're going to set the camera up, teach an authentic lesson, and see then what you capture and what you can analyze from those data. The data that you capture in that sense are very robust. There is a lot going on in an entire lesson. There's a lot going on that is sometimes overwhelming for teacher candidates to look at because they are not exactly sure what's relevant and irrelevant on that data because it is so robust. And video analysis is very flexible. You can, choose any sort of age group you want to focus on, disability type. You can pick any content area. You can say, today I want to focus on classroom management. Last month I was focusing on explicit instruction. So the activity itself is flexible to align with whatever the goals, the professional development goals are for that candidate. And it's very feasible. So it's not expensive. Everyone has nowadays a camera usually in their pocket, on their smartphone, on their laptop, on their iPad. And so it's not expensive to be able to capture your teaching in authentic settings and then to go through this experience of reviewing and self-reflecting and self-evaluation and then refinement. So feasibility, I think, is important, particularly for teacher education programs, thinking about how do we scale these activities? How do we make sure that teachers can have meaningful yet realistic expectations set in terms of how often they're going to do sort of video analysis type reflection-based activities. So there are many positives to video analysis, but I'm going to circle back to it can be very overwhelming for a teacher candidate who's just learning about the profession, just learning about what are evidence-based practices, what do they look like when they're being implemented. It's very overwhelming to say, here's a 40-minute video. I want you to watch this and tell me how you did. And in fact, if we don't structure these types of activities, candidates usually will just revert back to summarization, surface level engagement because they're not exactly sure how else to engage with the video data. So I want to just quickly talk about one approach that we can use as teacher educators to help better structure and scaffold skills like observing, teaching in action, observing video data, and also how do you reflect in a way that is more meaningful than just summarizing chronologically what happened in a lesson from beginning to end. Right, it's complicated. So we can use practice-based learning opportunities to build capacity for more meaningful growth. And the first thing I would say is we can use 3 phases. Phase 1 being help teacher candidates understand practice. How do they understand what they're looking at when they see video evidence? So the one way of doing this is to have them watch videos of other teachers to start with. So this is not, remember, don't start at the end, start at way at the beginning of their prep program. We can show teacher candidates videos of their veteran teachers, examples, non-examples. You can vary the context of the videos, but the important piece is here, you're teaching them how to watch the video, what to look for, what's relevant, what's irrelevant, and also you're teaching them a continuum of reflective practice. And so the continuum that I use is a 4-phase continuum of reflective practice. There are so many out there in the research, you can pick anyone you like. I find that candidates respond better when the things that you're asking them to reflect on are concrete as opposed to abstract. So if you say things like, give me some theoretical response to your higher order thinking that was taking place during this, it's very much overwhelming for them to sort of bring that back to concrete evidence in the video. So rather, I usually stick with describe, analyze, judge, apply. Describe what's happening. Describe a detailed decision that you made. If it's your video, in this case, if you're watching a video of somebody else, describe something that you see that the teacher did. Analyze why you think that happened. Why, if it's your video, why did you make that choice? If you're watching a video of somebody else, why do you think it took place? Judge the success of that decision. So looking at the outcomes that occurred in the classroom, not just saying it felt really good. It felt like the students enjoyed it. Those sorts of things are not anchored in data. And so I'm always encouraging candidates to anchor their responses in data. So judging from the student outcomes. So if it felt really good, why did it feel really good? What did you see happening? Everyone was responding. You had 9 out of 10 hands up. Everyone was able to complete the task in the allotted amount of time. Those are sort of indicators of this is happening in the way that I had intended it to happen. And then finally, after they judge the success of a decision that they either observed on somebody else's teaching video or that they themselves had captured on a video, applying those insights to future lessons. So given what you saw here in this video, what would you do differently? Or what do you think the teacher in the video should do differently? Or maybe keep the same? What should they increase? What should they decrease? Just insights to make them think forward. And this is the most difficult piece. Teacher candidates want to stay over in that describe area, describe what's going on. It's very difficult for them to then take all of these pieces, put that together and say, now, given what I've seen here, this is where I think this should go in the future. This is how this information, this new insight I just gained through this reflective activity is going to change my thinking or my practice for the future. So introducing something like this early allows them to, teacher candidates, to have practice with this process of, okay, reflecting doesn't mean summarizing. Reflecting actually means that I'm engaging in critical thinking and decision-making, so that way, when they do move through their teacher preparation program and are ready for looking at their own video, this is comfortable to them. So phase 2 would be something similar, except for now, maybe you're introducing one of those either micro teaching opportunities, or in this case, in this example, I have the simulated teaching. So I had a study where teacher candidates were teaching their peers in our teacher prep course 3 times throughout the semester. They broke into small groups. They focused on how are they going to model practice for their for students in either math or reading lesson. And they taught to a small group of their peers, and they video recorded themselves while they were teaching on their smartphones. I just gave them these little tabletop tripods to attach their smartphone. Very inexpensive. I think they're like $6 on Amazon. They recorded themselves teaching, and then they, right then and there, immediately after teaching, they watched their video back and they engaged in that reflective continuum, looking at describe, analyze, judge, apply. I was specifying for them what I wanted them to focus on, because if I said, focus on whatever you think is important, they picked things that were my tone of voice, my attire I was wearing, rather than saying my questioning techniques, my precision in language. So I try to, again, build in additional guidance on what they should be looking at in the video. So in this phase, they're connecting the things that they learned about how do you understand practice and how do you understand reflection in phase 1. Now they're trying it in low stakes settings. We're not in the dynamic classroom. We're in low stakes settings with our friends, with our peers. If they totally screw up, they haven't impacted any children. They can just say, friends, I'm going to start over. I totally messed that up. And their friends will say, it's no problem. And it's still an opportunity for them to practice some of their teaching strategies and apply that professional knowledge that they're developing throughout their preparation program. So the mechanism starts to get more familiar. They're used to the camera. They're used to the continuum of reflective practice. They're used to this record, review, reflect cycle. And so then by the time they do get to the more formal student teaching experiences, there isn't such a dramatic learning curve to take place. You've built in some of those prerequisite skills. By the time they're ready to then go into the classroom and set up that camera in front of in an authentic, dynamic setting, they've already learned about many of the introductory things that were important to sort of promoting success for this learning experience, making it more about meaningful engagement rather than compliance mindset. Oh, I have to turn in 2 videos this semester. That's not what we're looking for here. I'll be happy to show examples of what I call reflection matrix, but this is in the most simplistic definition, a graphic organizer that I provide to teacher candidates to encourage them to look at specific teaching elements in their video and helps them with that feeling of, this is very overwhelming. I have a 40-minute video. I have a 10-minute video. Even 10 minutes of video data is a lot to look at. So helping them to say, I have a, a 10, 20, whatever it is, minute video, but on this review, I'm going to focus on these 4 teaching elements. It really does help to focus. And then reminding them about describe, analyze, judge, apply for each of those teaching elements so that they're looking across not just description, but all the way to how do I apply this to future lessons. So again, much of the research that I've conducted in this space has all concluded that there is total potential for growth for teacher candidates to really think that this is meaningful, but it's only with that support, the guidance, the structure that they do demonstrate improved instructional practices, improved ability to reflect in a more critical way, and that they also think it's actually worth their time and effort rather than just saying, well, I turned in 2 videos and no one ever said anything to me about it, so I guess it was fine. That's not what we're looking for. We want them to say, it was challenging, it was tough, I had to really dig in, and I think that comes with the structure behind how do you use this technology in a meaningful way. So with that, I will leave it so we can answer questions. Let me stop sharing. And again, if I can share any resources of things I've covered very quickly, I'm happy to do that.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Kugel and Dr. Negro. Please, if you'd like to, put questions in the chat while we're waiting for questions to pop up. I have a few myself that I would like to ask. One of the things that I was wondering as I was listening to the process, which I think sounds fantastic, when I was going through teacher prep, I did not have anything like that. Oh, it's a long time ago. What is the process of co-reflection or co-revision with a coach or the teacher to really look closely at the practices that need to be improved or modeling what needs to be done differently as they're navigating this process?
So I can let Dr. Kugel talk about a little bit about how we did infuse the 2 of them together. But one thing I want to point out is that when you're thinking logistically about how do you bring in the mentor or the supervisor or the internship instructor into this process, the important thing is to, in my professional opinion, is to let the candidate lead. So that means they provide reflection first before they receive feedback. Because what happens is if you as the teacher educator provide that feedback and then say, okay, now when you get around to it, I want you to watch a video and reflect. What they do is they reflect on the feedback. And so we're not targeting those skills of how do you self-evaluate? How do you critically reflect? What we're doing is saying, go ahead and respond to what I've told you about your performance. And they won't have that level of support when they get into the classroom. There isn't going to be someone to say, hey, I took all this time and effort to, watch a video of you teaching or to zoom into your class, and I've written out these grows and glows for you, and here you go. It's not, that level of support isn't there. So we want really to encourage them to have the ability to set their own camera up and say, I know what to look for. I know how to look at my instruction. I know how to analyze my thought process here and decide if this was useful or not. I know how to apply that to the future. So they do absolutely go hand in hand really nicely. It's really important in terms of how you order those elements to make sure that you're not losing those critical skills that we're targeting with this video analysis. Go ahead, Kristen.
Yeah, so we paired ECoaching with video analysis a couple of years ago, and it was really, really interesting. So the teacher candidates selected a focus child that they were wanting to include as part of this project, and we worked together to select a target practice. And so we engaged using video conferencing in real time, but we were also recording those observations. So the teacher candidates were getting feedback in real time, which was the e-coaching component. But then after they received feedback, they also were given access to the video that we recorded. And then they used the template that Sarah had the visual for to think about their target practice. And we actually broke up the target practice into those elements, those teaching elements that Sarah described. So each target practice had about 3 to 4 elements. And what was really nice for them, I think, was that they got feedback in real time, but then they were able to observe themselves, effectively reflect, right? More critical thinking, reflection. But then they also saw how those target practices, what were the elements of each of those target practices, and they were able to reflect on each of those. And what was nice for us, there's the template, thank you for pulling that up, that's the reflection matrix that they were asked to respond to as they were watching the video of themselves during these observations. But what was really nice for us too was we were quantifying, right, counting how many times they were using the target practice, but we were also capturing data on the quality of that practice, which was something really new and innovative to this research. We have a lot of research that talks about how the quantity of practices change. And this research is now published, and but that allowed us to also capture, yes, how did the quantity change upon them receiving feedback in real time, but how did the quality of the practices change as well? And so the way we figured out the quality of the practices was looking at each of those teaching elements. And so, and we saw from that study that both the quantity and quality of practices increased. And then Sarah also captured data on how their reflections changed over time as well, which was really interesting.
Wow, that's fascinating.
I was just going to add to that it in terms of a teacher ed lens, I think it helped with buy-in that everything is cohesive. So the target practices that Kristen was providing real-time feedback through e-coaching on were the same practices we were asking them to look for in their own video, were the same practices we were asking them to reflect on with this reflection matrix. And it helped to make it feel cohesive. What these things were not disconnected from one another. And I'm showing this example because I'll put the link to the website. There are many of these matrices, and you're welcome to use whichever ones are helpful. This focus of these was very specific. So Kristen had a initial coaching meeting with each of the candidates to identify what was a goal that they wanted to focus on. And with our guidance, we had some baseline video of them that we watched ahead of time before Kristen went into the coaching session. So we were sort of guiding the discussion where we knew they really needed some support. And then they focused on whichever area they selected with their coach, with Kristen, and they stuck with that through the whole internship. And that is another piece to emphasize. Sticking with the one behavior that you want to improve allows you to track improvement over time. You can see it in the video data. So we use the video data to measure their improved instructional practice. You can see it in their written reflections. We use those data to measure their improved reflective practice, but really for them as candidates, it helped them to see the same. So here, even though there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different things that they're writing about, it's all on this umbrella topic of eliciting participation from all students through open-ended responses. That's just one tiny piece of instruction. When you think about how dynamic instruction is, this is another point, and I know that Mary Brownell makes this point often, that you have to be able to do all of these things all at the same time. And so maybe by the end of a student teaching experience, you could say, I want you to look across your teaching practices, but not on the first video. They need some time to be able to learn, how do I pick this apart and analyze each little piece, each decision I'm making. So that's like sort of the deconstruction of teaching. And then the reconstruction of it comes towards the end. And I would argue that we're still working on that in service with our teachers. How do they look at all of these pieces that are so complex? Think about classroom management, how it impacts and plays off of instruction and vice versa. So I think that's well beyond the question.
That was great. Thank you. And the last part that you said was exactly what I was wondering is, do they pick one practice? How long do you look at it? How long does it take to see change? So thank you for sharing that. We had a few other questions come in the chat. So does this differ with in-service teachers? Are there additional challenges? Are certain elements more simple with in-service teachers?
Kristen, do you want to answer first?
Sure. Just thinking about the question. So I know, I believe in both of our research, we've done this research with both pre-service and in-service teachers. And I think what's consistent across is that we see variability across all adult learners. So that's the first thought that comes to mind. I think, there's different types of responsibilities that we have to consider in preparation in terms of logistics between pre-service and in-service teachers. So maybe that would be, I think, a more common difference. But in terms of the results and the data, I would say consistently we're being responsive to each individual adult learner. There's variability in how much time and support every adult learner needs to. I'm really focused on, using a practice with fidelity when I say that. But yeah, Sarah, I'm interested in your thoughts.
I just put the link, and I think that's trackstudentlearning.weebly.com. It's just a website where I've housed a lot of these materials. So if you want to go and download some of these templates that we are showing you, you have access to them in a Word doc that's editable for you. But to circle back to this conversation, Kristen's right. We've implemented these approaches with both pre-service and in-service teachers, or teacher candidates who are teachers, in-service teachers, coming back and getting additional preparation. And we found that even one session, even one coaching session, even one video session makes an impact. More is better, but nothing is not a place to stick. So if you can only do it once, I think I published I'm a co-author on a meta-analysis that looked specifically at different learner characteristics and the impact of video analysis. And what they did say was one or more sessions will make a difference. I think that you have a huge learning curve involved in it. In terms of in-service teachers, I think the piece of it is showing them how to do this on their own, as opposed to having guidance in terms of reflection or video analysis, because again, their mentor teacher is probably very overwhelmed, probably has way too many people on their caseload, probably checks in maybe once a quarter and says, do you have the textbook? Do you have the pacing guide? They're not saying, oh, I was able to sit down for 45 minutes and watch your recorded video. So for in-service teachers, it's really about helping them to buy in and see the meaning for themselves, rather than saying that I'm depending on somebody else to watch my video and give me feedback. If they can get feedback from a peer, that's fantastic, but it's just not always feasible. So I published in Teaching Exceptional Children, and I can drop the article into the chat about how do you set up video analysis for in-service teachers. And I think that we were focusing on classroom management strategies in that article. But the concepts are there. Again, teacher candidates, they still have that compliance piece. That's not always the same as in-service teachers. So for pre-service teachers, the emphasis really should be on building those foundational skills. How do you look at instruction? How do you reflect beyond just summarizing? And then when you're in service, how do you put all these pieces together in a more dynamic way?
Great, thank you. And Someone else asked, what would this look like in an asynchronous course format?
I think it works really well asynchronous, the things that we're talking about. If it's asynchronous and it's self-paced, like on demand, where maybe they have learning modules and you're more passively instructing them, then the focus has to be on accuracy, in my opinion, of self-evaluation techniques, accuracy of reflection, because they aren't going to have that real-time feedback. And maybe Kristen's figured out ways to build that in and she could talk about that. But I would say that what I've seen is if they're not provided with structure on how to reflect, on how to look at video, on how to evaluate their own performance using either the Danielson framework or other frameworks that are available, if teacher candidates are not taught how to use those, their evaluations of themselves are actually closer to a rating of competence than they are a rating of ability. And so teacher candidates who feel like they're profession ready will write about how great they are and will reflect in ways that demonstrate all of their strengths, but it may not actually be in alignment with their current practice and their current levels of performance. So the emphasis, in my opinion, would need to be on accuracy and helping to put in those supports to make sure that they are really understanding what is good practice and what does it look like, and am I doing it?
So I was just wondering, just along those lines, and you just sort of said it, how do you talked about the mindset shift from compliance to being a lifelong learner. How do you help support the mindset shift within the teachers for, I guess, their teaching practices, or as you were sort of just saying, how do you help them approximate change, maybe in their cultural responsiveness or how they're responding to students? Are there certain things that you do to help support that?
Let's try to give Kristen a chance. I think, first of all, a lot of this is self-driven, and I think that helps with the engagement. So them choosing a targeted goal to focus on, them identifying, here's an area that I want to work on, helps to then have motivation to work on that. If they think that they are the best at building relationships with their students, then finding somewhere where you can, as a supervisor or a coach or a mentor, can gain some common ground and say, hey, this is probably an area where we could even refine that further, will help to have buy-in. If they think that you're making a mistake in the way that you're focusing their efforts, then you'll see that. And the other thing is, the interaction is important. So in one of my studies, my comparison group, they went through all the same activities. They had to watch their videos. They had to reflect in the same way, but there was no feedback. There was no coaching. There was no feedback on how are they looking at their practices? How accurate are they? And you could see a flat line in what happened, both in their performance of these targeted skills and in their reflections. Nobody was saying to change anything, so they just kept doing what they had been doing, as compared to the folks who were getting that extra coaching. So I think you can see that they can see the growth too. So giving them in transparency is important. So saying, here's how you're going to be evaluated when you get into the field. Your district uses the Danielson framework. This is how you're going to be evaluated. And then using that and bringing that in, I think that's another piece of building that buy-in, like, oh, these are the things I'm going to have to be expected to do when I get into the profession. So I want to know what they are now. I think that makes it more meaningful rather than saying, oh, this is just what George Mason's program says matters, but when I get in the field, that's not what's really going to matter. So all those things, the more cohesive you can make it and the more connected to the field you can make it, I think does really build on their motivation and engagement. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think the reflection opportunities in themselves really facilitate the idea of lifelong learning. I mean, especially when looking at that judge and apply section of the matrix, right? Because they're thinking about, okay, I'm judging the success of what I just did, and how am I going to continue to apply that? Well, that's an element of lifelong learning in my mind. I think the other thing that we do a lot of is having conversations about being a lifelong learner. I know I make this statement probably like a broken record. The day that we think that we have perfected something in life, that's a really dangerous spot to be, right? We all want to be thinking about how we can continue to enhance our practice, both personally and professionally. So we have a lot of conversations about it. And I think, just acknowledging that creates a safe space perhaps for those conversations and reflections. And I think everybody comes in with a different type of disposition. So hopefully through those conversations, we're, leveling some of that out, where we can have conversations regarding how we can continue to be lifelong learners, and just reflecting on that in particular as well.
Great. Yeah. And it sounds like you both have that critical piece of not letting them make the same mistakes over and over again. That's part of the coaching and support, and helping them to see themselves where they need to grow as learners.
And if you ask them in the beginning, how are you looking forward to this? They're going to say no. I mean, it's the reality of who wants to watch themselves on video. Even the bug in ear, I think they're nervous of, is this going to be interruptive to my instruction? And so they're very apprehensive when we've surveyed, pre-survey, like predict what your experience is going to be like. It's not the most positive. I'm anxious about this. I don't want other people to see my video. I don't know if I'm going to be distracted by somebody in my ear. So the actual engagement of it is what changes their realization that, oh, this is actually really helpful. I do see immediate, in the case of ECoaching, we can show you graph after graph, beautiful graphs that Kristen and her colleagues make. The changes are immediate. And in terms of the reflection, it's more of a progression, a long-term change that you're targeting these practices, you're focusing on them. So we can show them the changes that take place with their target behaviors. And I think that makes a difference, because when we survey them at the end, they'll say, it wasn't what I thought. It wasn't as scary. It wasn't disruptive. It was actually really helpful to have that prompt. It made me feel really good when I got positive feedback right on the spot. Or it was really helpful to have this ruler that I could use to look at my teaching. There's no wiggle room when you have concrete rulers, and a lot of students will call it a ruler in their feedback. And I think that's how they see it. It's more concrete. It's not abstract. I can take this ruler, I can put it up to myself and see where I land. And they'll say it's not always fun. It's hard. It's hard to look at yourself in this way, but it's meaningful, and I think worthwhile. So they do change. Some people think, oh no, it was horrible the whole time through, or it was great the whole time through. And so then you wonder, are they actually investing the time into it? It's really those folks who have a change in their approach that you realize they've really dug into this and given it a shot. So.
Thank you. And then another question came in from Ashley. Does the impact of the feedback have a lasting effect? For example, does fidelity remain high during the follow-up phase?
Yeah, so we do. So some of the studies included a maintenance condition where we removed feedback and continued observations. And although there's some variability across each adult learner, again, we know that they consistently maintained their use of a practice at a higher level than before they were getting feedback. Some, were at a consistent level with when they were getting feedback. Others decreased, but were higher than when they started before they started receiving feedback. So I think that's also an area where we need to continue to do more work, right? And continue follow up, circling back to provide feedback after fading out feedback, for example. And I think that makes sense. If we think about, using any kind of practice with fidelity, we might not need that intensified feedback on a regular basis, but having check-ins less frequently, for example, once we've mastered a target skill, to check in and see how that's going and then be responsive to that is important.
Great. Thanks. That's really helpful. And so I guess if you guys were going to leave the participants with some recommendations, what would those be for teacher educators who want to use these strategies to increase implementation of evidence-based practices?
So my first recommendation would be to start with why it matters. Don't jump right into this is what we're doing this semester, or these are the requirements on your syllabus, because that's perpetuating the compliance mindset. So by first saying we're going to target these goals, these professional goals this semester or in this project or this week or tonight in class, and here's how we're going to target them, and here's why this is a good approach. That bit of, intro really does make a difference. So I would just say start there. Don't start at, we've got to improve the way you're talking to your students, and you're going to do 5 video reflections, and you're going to turn in 3 of these and 2 coaching sessions and 4 of these. That's not going to get them excited or see how it matters. So that's my number one. And also, I would say that you're going to have technical difficulties. And as the person who's rolling this out, maintaining a positive attitude, a problem solver mindset, so to speak, of, technology glitches happen, but there's many different ways we can work around this. And we often have plan A, plan B, plan C in place when we know that we're going to go and implement these things. And so I would say have a plan B and also a positive attitude as the one who's rolling it out. Because if they even sense that you're getting frustrated with the technology, they will look for a way to say, let's just, let's skirt this. Let's just let that go today. So positive persistence, because it does pay off. I'm unable to, on a side note, I'm unable to add documents to the chat itself. So I'm happy to share if anyone wants to email me who is participating today. If you have any questions about any of the studies that we referenced or any of the resources we talked about, I'm happy to respond via email and share any of those documents with you. And I'll turn it over to Kristen for her recommendation.
Yeah, so I love your recommendation. And I would say, just to piggyback on that, 2 words that come to mind are individualization and differentiation. So individualization is going to enhance your buy-in. So I mentioned there's a lot of different options with technologies, and your teacher candidates can be part of that decision-making process. So that can be one way to enhance the buy-in, especially initially. And then the differentiation goes back to making data-based decisions. I love what Sarah said about, thinking about what we see and what the data are telling us. And we want to do that as teacher educators as well. What are the data telling us that our teacher candidates need, and how can we differentiate our approach? Just like, how can we model that for them? Just like we're encouraging them to then do that with students. So individualization and differentiation would be my number one recommendation.
Great. Thank you so much. I guess we're running out of time here, but I just wanted to tell you how much I learned today. I thought it was fantastic. I haven't been in teacher ed for a while. I was at OSEP before coming to CAST. So it was great to learn these new things and hear the way technology is being used in teacher prep. So thank you both. I look forward to getting to work with you again, and we hope to hear more from you on CITL.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And we'll put our emails in the chat in case anyone wants to follow up. Thank you very much for this time.
Thank you.